When Arthur Miller saw thousands of people kneeling in Central Park, weeping and begging forgiveness from the homeless man he had tried to humiliate, he knew his life of privilege and arrogance had come to an end in a way he could never have imagined. 6 months earlier, on a gray Tuesday morning, Ray woke up on the cold pavement of Central Park to the familiar sound of pigeons squabbling over crumbs around him. His unkempt gray hair contrasted with the serene smile he always wore, even while sleeping on old newspapers covered only by a tattered blanket. There was something about this man in his 50s that defied the logic of urban misery. His eyes shone with a light that even the harshness of the streets hadn't been able to extinguish. "Good morning, folks," he murmured to the birds, sharing with them the last pieces of bread he had saved from yesterday's donation. A scrawny, pregnant, and hungry tabby cat cautiously approached. Ray smiled and offered her half a cream cracker. "For you and your babies, Hope," he said, a name he had given the feline himself. On the other side of the city, in the top floors of a mirrored glass skyscraper, Arthur Miller awoke in his master suite with a panoramic view. At 45, he owned one of the largest investment firms in the country. His mornings always began the same way: a shower with imported water, specialty coffee delivered directly from Hawaii, and reading the numbers that confirmed his growing power. That morning, however, something different occupied his thoughts. "These wretched people are multiplying," he grumbled, observing from his window the dark spots that represented homeless people scattered throughout the city. To Arthur, poverty was a choice, a demonstration of weakness of character. If they don't work, it's because they don't want to. If they don't prosper, it's because they're lazy, he used to say in his motivational speeches, where he charged fortunes to teach other business executives to think like millionaires. Arthur had built his fortune by buying properties from indebted families at ridiculously low prices and reselling them for stratospheric profits. His methods were legal, but morally questionable. He took advantage of other people's desperation, the financial ignorance of simple people, the urgent need of those who were at the end of their rope. He never physically hurt anyone, but he left a trail of evicted families, destroyed dreams, and wounded dignity. On social media, Arthur maintained an image of an authentic businessman who speaks inconvenient truths. His followers, mostly young people dazzled by his ostentation, applauded his attacks against bums who live on handouts and social welfarism. He posted photos of his expensive meals, imported cars, and international trips, always accompanied by phrases like, "While you complain, I work," or "Poverty is a state of mind." That Tuesday, walking through Central Park after a meeting, Arthur spotted Ray chatting affectionately with a group of children playing near the fountain. The homeless man was telling stories, making funny faces, and sharing with the children some candy he had received. The children laughed, hugged him without disgust or prejudice, and called him Uncle Ray. "Pathetic," Arthur muttered, taking a discreet photo with his cell phone. "I'll show my followers what street reality is, bums manipulating innocent children to gain sympathy." But something in the scene bothered him more than expected. There was a purity in that interaction, a genuine joy that contrasted brutally with the cynicism he cultivated. The children weren't there out of pity or charity. They genuinely liked Ray, and he, even with nothing to offer but stories and smiles, radiated a wealth that Arthur couldn't understand. That night, in his penthouse apartment, Arthur couldn't forget the image. He sipped a $500 a bottle cognac while browsing through the comments of his followers, who praised his courage to expose the reality. But why did that strange feeling persist? Why did the memory of that smile disturb him so much? That's when the idea came. "I need something impactful for my next post," he thought. "Something that will really cause a stir." He remembered a horse auction he had witnessed weeks earlier, where old and sick animals were sold for slaughter. One in particular had caught his attention because of its deplorable condition: a brown horse with dull fur, covered in benign but visually shocking tumors, rejected even by the meat buyers. The animal had sad and melancholic eyes, scars all over its body, and labored breathing. "Perfect," Arthur murmured, already imagining the repercussions. "I'll gift the beggar in the park with that dying horse. It will be hilarious to see his face receiving a gift that nobody wants." The idea was cruel, but legal: to buy the condemned animal and publicly deliver it to the homeless man, filming everything for social media. It would be presented as an act of charity, but his followers would understand the irony. A useless gift for a useless person, the perfect joke for those who understand incorrect political humor. The next day, Arthur put the plan into action. He sent his assistants to buy the sick horse from the auction. It cost him less than a bottle of wine from his cellar. The animal was carefully transported in a trailer, accompanied by hidden cameras and some young company employees, all instructed to discreetly film the beneficiary's reaction. The horse, which Arthur ironically nicknamed Lazarus because it will resurrect the beggar's self-esteem, arrived at Central Park on a sunny Thursday afternoon. Ray was sitting under a tree, mending an old backpack with needle and thread borrowed from Mrs. Concesio, the woman who sold flowers nearby. When the trailer stopped in front of him and men in suits unloaded the debilitated animal, Ray was genuinely confused. The horse was visibly ill, with apparent tumors under its skin, labored breathing, and a resigned look. Its ribs were visible, its legs trembled slightly, and there were healed wounds scattered across its body. "It's for you," one of the assistants said, handing him a makeshift rope as a halter. A gift from an anonymous admirer who believes that everyone deserves a chance. Ray looked around, noticing the half-hidden cameras, the sly smiles of the young men in suits, the small crowd gathering to watch the spectacle. He wasn't stupid. He understood perfectly that this was a cruel setup, a public humiliation disguised as kindness. Some rich guy was having fun at his expense. For a moment, he felt the urge to refuse, to return the animal, and expose the cruelty of this joke. It would be the natural reaction, the response any person with dignity would give. But then he looked into the horse's eyes, eyes that reflected a sadness and defeat as profound as those he himself had felt during his worst moments on the street. The animal was as rejected as he was, as discarded by the world as he was, as considered useless by society as he was. "You and I, my friend," Ray murmured, extending a hand to gently touch the horse's muzzle. "We've been discarded by the world. Let's walk together, shall we?" The horse slightly raised its head, as if it understood. There was something in the man's voice, in the gentleness of his touch, that was unlike anything it had ever known. There was no condescending pity, no disgust, no impatience. There was recognition, there was brotherhood. "Your name will be Lazarus," Ray said, stroking the animal's thin neck, "because we all deserve a second chance, don't we?" The cameramen expected laughter, complaints, maybe even despair. They didn't expect this, a man with nothing receiving a cruel gift with the same dignity a king would receive a treasure. The scene was filmed, but it didn't have the expected comedic effect. There was something profoundly unsettling about the serenity with which Ray had accepted the sick animal. In the following days, something extraordinary began to happen in Central Park. Ray didn't try to get rid of Lazarus, nor did he abandon him, nor did he complain about the joke. Instead, he began to care for the animal with a dedication that impressed those who passed by. He slept beside him, shared with him the little food he could get, whispered to him in the cold mornings. "You know Lazarus," he said, brushing the horse's dull coat with an old brush he had found in the trash. "People think we're worthless because we don't make money, but I think our worth lies in other things." The horse, gradually, began to respond to the care. He didn't miraculously improve. The tumors were still there, his breathing was still heavy, but there was something different in his eyes, a spark of trust that hadn't existed before. He followed Ray through the park, lay down beside him during the day, whinnied softly when he heard his voice. The children who played in the park quickly grew fond of the unusual duo. "Uncle Ray, can I pet Lazarus?" they would ask, and he always replied, "Sure, but gently. Everyone likes to be treated with kindness, right?" Mrs. Concesio, the flower vendor, started bringing leftover vegetables from the market. "For the horse," she said, but everyone knew it was also a way to help Ray. Mr. Antonio, the cobbler on the corner, donated an old but clean blanket. "For the two of you to cover yourselves on cold nights," he explained, trying to hide his emotion. Slowly, something magical was happening. The presence of Ray and Lazarus was transforming the park's dynamic. People who normally rushed past, ignoring the homeless, began to stop to observe this unusual friendship. There was something touching in the way the man cared for the rejected animal, something that sparked reflections on compassion, dignity, and human worth. If he takes such good care of a sick animal, imagine what his heart must be like, a teacher commented to her colleagues. I've never seen so much love in a relationship like this, said a local merchant. The stories about Ray and Lazarus began to spread throughout the city by word of mouth, through social media, through WhatsApp groups. But not as Arthur Miller had planned. Instead of cruel laughter, people shared the story with admiration and tenderness. Instead of mockery, there was respect. A few weeks after the gift, a local journalist named Marina Santos was passing through the park when she saw the scene, Ray carefully combing Lazarus's mane, humming an old song softly. There was something profoundly touching about that image. A man without material possessions offering emotional richness to an animal the world considered disposable. Marina approached respectfully. "Excuse me, sir, I'm a journalist and I'd like to talk to you about your story with the horse. May I?" Ray smiled, that serene smile he carried even in the worst circumstances. "Sure, ma'am, but there's not much to tell. Just two rejects taking care of each other. How did you get Lazarus? Was it a gift?" Ray paused, stroking the animal's neck. "It was, yes. Someone thought it would be funny to give me a sick horse. They must have thought I'd get angry, or despair, or do something that would cause laughter." His eyes shone with a quiet wisdom. "But do you know what I thought when I saw Lazarus? I thought, this animal needs someone who understands what it's like to be rejected, and I understand." Marina's article was published 3 days later in the local newspaper with the headline, "The Man Who Transformed Cruelty into Love." The report told the story of Ray and Lazarus, but also investigated the origins of the gift. It wasn't difficult to discover that Arthur Miller was behind the donation. Sources confirmed that businessman Arthur Miller, known for his controversial stances on social inequality, was responsible for the gift of the sick horse to the homeless man. What was intended to be a public humiliation turned into a lesson on dignity and compassion, Marina wrote. The report went viral. Within hours it was being shared across the country. But the tone wasn't one of indignation against Arthur, it was one of admiration for Ray. People were moved by the way he had transformed an act of cruelty into a demonstration of pure love. At this point in the story, it's important for you, dear reader, to understand how small acts of kindness can create waves of transformation that echo far beyond our imagination. If these stories of overcoming adversity and humanity touch your heart, consider subscribing to our channel to continue receiving stories like this, because in difficult times, we need to remember that light always finds a way to shine through the cracks of darkness, and every shared story can be the seed of hope that someone needs to hear today. Arthur Miller woke up one Saturday morning to his phone exploding with notifications. His publicist was panicking, his business partners were calling furiously, and his inbox was overflowing with angry comments. At first he didn't understand what was happening, then he read the news report. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, but he wasn't referring to the journalist, he was talking about himself. For the first time in years, Arthur found himself confronted with the moral consequences of his actions. There was nothing illegal about what he had done, but there was something profoundly wrong, and now the whole world knew it. Worse than the public exposure was Ray's reaction. Arthur expected hate, outrage, some reaction that would justify his worldview. Instead, he found pure dignity. The man he had tried to humiliate had responded with a nobility of character that Arthur himself had never shown, not even in his best moments. On impulse, he decided to go to the park to see the results of his prank firsthand, maybe to confront Ray, maybe to try to reverse the situation somehow. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon, driving his red Ferrari that cost more than a middle-class house. What he saw left him speechless. Central Park had been transformed. Dozens of people were there, not just passing through, but participating in something that looked like a spontaneous community. Families were having picnics near Ray and Lazarus, children were playing freely, young people were playing guitars, elderly people were playing dominoes. At the center of it all, like a gentle sun radiating warmth, was Ray, talking to everyone, offering smiles, sharing stories. And Lazarus was different. He still had the tumors, he still breathed with difficulty, but there was something in his posture that wasn't there before. He interacted with the children, let himself be petted by the visitors, even attempted a few dance steps when Ray hummed a tune. The horse had found dignity. Arthur watched from afar, shielded by the dark-tinted windows of his car. He felt a toxic mixture of shame, envy, and something he couldn't name, perhaps admiration, perhaps a desire to belong to that community of affection that had sprung up around his victim. Why doesn't he hate me? He thought. Why doesn't he curse me? Why doesn't he use this situation to get revenge? But Ray seemed genuinely oblivious to the question of who had given him the horse. He didn't talk about it. He didn't show resentment. He didn't turn his story into a victim narrative. He simply took care of Lazarus and let love speak for itself. That night, Arthur couldn't sleep. For the first time in decades, he questioned what truly mattered in life. He had enough money to buy anything, but he had never experienced the peace he saw on the face of that homeless man. He had thousands of followers on social media, but he had never inspired the kind of genuine affection that Ray evoked in people. The following days were a personal hell for Arthur. His company started losing major clients. Nobody wanted to associate their brand with someone who humiliated vulnerable people for fun. His wealthy friends started avoiding him, not out of moral outrage, but because he had become problematic for their reputations. Even his social media followers, once so loyal, began to criticize or abandon him. But the worst was Ray's silence. The man hadn't given a single interview attacking him, hadn't made a single post complaining, hadn't taken any legal action. His silence was more devastating than any accusation could be. 2 weeks after the report, on a rainy Wednesday, Arthur made a decision that surprised even himself. He went to the park, got out of the car, and walked directly to Ray. The homeless man was under a plastic tarp, protecting himself and the horse from the light rain. Upon seeing Arthur approach, he showed no surprise or hostility. He simply looked at him with those serene eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. "You know who I am?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I do," Ray replied simply. "And you know why I gave you the horse?" "I do." Arthur waited for a continuation that didn't come. Ray just kept stroking Lazarus's neck, who was calmly chewing on a handful of grass someone had brought. "Why don't you hate me?" Arthur exploded. "Why don't you curse me? Why don't you try to get revenge?" Ray looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because hate only hurts the hater. And because you've punished yourself more than I ever could." The simplicity of the answer hit Arthur like a punch to the stomach. It was true. He had become a prisoner of his own cruelty, isolated in his wealth, unable to experience the genuine joy he saw in that man who possessed nothing but a sick horse. "I wanted to hurt you," Arthur admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "I know," Ray said, "but it ended up giving me the greatest gift of my life." "How so?" Ray smiled. That smile that defied all logic in a cruel world. "You gave me a friend. You gave me a family." He gestured to the people who, even in the rain, were scattered throughout the park, living their lives in community. "You gave me the chance to show that love exists, even where no one expects to find it." Arthur felt tears burning his eyes. He hadn't cried since he was a child. I messed everything up, my company, my reputation, my relationships, all because of a stupid joke." "No," Ray said gently. "You destroyed empty things to discover what truly matters. Now you can rebuild on a true foundation." At that moment, something cracked inside Arthur. Decades of cynicism, of cruelty, disguised as realism, of arrogance masquerading as honesty. He knelt in the mud of the park, before the man he had tried to humiliate, and wept as he hadn't wept since he was a boy. "Forgive me," he sobbed. "Please, forgive me." Ray put a hand on the kneeling man's shoulder. "You're forgiven, brother. Now get up and come help me take care of Lazarus. He's hungry." From that day on, something extraordinary happened in the city. Arthur began frequenting the park daily, not as a tourist of his own cruelty, but as a student of humanity. He sold his superfluous cars and used the money to buy veterinary medicine for Lazarus. He traded his penthouse apartment for a smaller one and directed the difference to a fund that helped homeless people. It wasn't a magical transformation. Arthur had decades of emotional hardness to deconstruct. There were relapses, moments of impatience, difficulties in dealing with his new, more modest financial reality. But Ray was always there, with his infinite patience and simple wisdom, showing that greatness isn't measured by zeros in a bank account. "Do you know what the secret to happiness is?" Ray said one such afternoon, as the two cared for Lazarus under the golden autumn sun. "What?" Arthur asked, genuinely curious. "It's too simple for those who have complicated their lives too much," Ray smiled. "The secret is to realize that we already have everything we need to be happy. The rest is just decoration." Lazarus, as if understanding the conversation, snorted softly and rested his head on Ray's chest. The horse never fully recovered. The tumors remained, his breathing remained heavy, but he had found something more valuable than perfect health. He had found unconditional love. 6 months after that first cruel encounter, Central Park had become a symbol in the city. People from all social classes went there not only to see Ray and Lazarus, but to experience a type of community they had forgotten existed. Families took their children to learn about compassion, young people went to seek perspective on what truly matters in life, the elderly found companionship and purpose. National media began covering what they called the miracle of Central Park. Documentaries were made, books were written, lectures were given on the phenomenon. But Ray refused any monetization of his story. "Love isn't for sale," he said simply. It was on one of these busy afternoons, with dozens of people enjoying the peace of the park, that the moment no one expected arrived. A group of influential city businessmen, people who were once close to Arthur and shared his elitist views, appeared in the park with a proposal. "Arthur," said the group's leader, a corpulent man in an expensive suit, "we understand you've been through a difficult time, but it's time to get back to reality. We have a business proposal that will recover everything you've lost." Arthur looked at his former colleagues, then at Ray, who watched the scene silently while brushing Lazarus. "What kind of proposal?" "Real estate speculation in this area. The park is appreciating in value because of this situation. We can buy the surrounding land at low prices and develop a commercial complex. You get back in the game, we make money, everyone's happy." The ensuing silence was thick. Dozens of people in the park stopped their activities to observe the conversation. It was a moment of testing. What would Arthur choose? The return to the world he knew, to easy wealth based on the exploitation of others, or the permanence in this new world of values he had discovered? Arthur looked around, at the children playing freely and happily, at the elderly playing dominoes in the shade, at Ray and Lazarus representing living proof that love and dignity can flourish in the most unlikely places. Then he looked at his former business partners, with their expensive clothes and cold smiles. "No," he said simply. "What do you mean, no?" the businessman insisted. "We're offering millions, Arthur. You can be rich again." "I am rich," Arthur replied, walking over to Ray and putting a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Richer than I've ever been." The businessman left grumbling about brainwashing and midlife crisis, but dozens of people who had witnessed that choice remained in the park and spontaneously applauded, not only for Arthur's refusal of the money, but for choosing values over profit, community over individualism, love over greed. That night, sitting side by side under the stars, with Lazarus lying placidly between them, Ray and Arthur talked about life. "You know you could be rich right now, right?" Ray said. "I know," Arthur replied, "but I also know that true wealth isn't counted in money." "And what did you learn in all these months?" Arthur thought for a moment before answering. "I learned that we spend our whole lives chasing things that won't make us happy. I learned that humiliating someone only reveals our own smallness. I learned that a sick horse can teach more about dignity than any university." He paused. But mostly I learned that it's never too late to start over, if we have the humility to accept that we were wrong. Ray smiled in the darkness. You know what's most beautiful about all this? It's not that you changed, it's that you discovered who you always were. Deep down, you were just covered by many layers of pain and fear. Fear of not being loved for who you are. So you invented this persona of a tough, successful man, superior to others. But deep down, you always knew it was just a disguise. Arthur was silent, processing that simple, devastating truth. It was exactly that. All his arrogance had been armor against the possibility of rejection, all his cruelty a way of striking first before being struck. And now? He asked. Now you can be who you truly are, Ray said. A good man who lost his way and had the courage to return. It was at that moment, under the starlit sky of the big city, that Arthur understood the full extent of his transformation. It wasn't just about changing his behavior or adopting new values. It was about reconnecting with his own humanity, which he had buried under layers of cynicism and ambition. The following months brought profound changes not only for Ray, Arthur, and Lazarus, but for the entire city. Their story had spread nationally, inspiring similar initiatives in other cities. Abandoned parks were revitalized, not by government projects or private investments, but by communities spontaneously organizing around values of compassion and solidarity. Arthur used his business knowledge to create a non-profit organization focused on connecting vulnerable people with opportunities for decent work. It wasn't traditional charity. It was about recognizing talents and potentials where society only saw problems. Ray, in turn, discovered he had a natural gift for mediating conflicts and soothing wounded hearts. People began seeking him out not only to admire his story with Lazarus, but to ask for advice on relationships, forgiveness, overcoming hurts. He never charged anything for these conversations, but received in return something far more valuable: the certainty that his existence made a difference in the world. Lazarus became a sort of involuntary equine therapist. Autistic children, lonely elderly people, troubled teenagers, all seemed to find peace in the presence of the gentle horse. Volunteer veterinarians began to care for him regularly, unable to cure his tumors, but keeping him comfortable and well-nourished. You know what I find most interesting about all this, commented Marina Santos, the journalist who had written the first report, during a conversation with Ray on a spring afternoon. It's that no one tried to turn you into celebrities or monetize the story. That's rare these days. Ray stroked Lazarus as he replied, because it's not about us, you know, it's about reminding people that kindness exists, that forgiveness is possible, that community still matters. The moment it becomes a business, it loses its magic. Marina agreed, looking around the park. There were families having picnics, young people studying under the trees, artists playing music, honest street vendors offering snacks at fair prices. It was a miniature version of how society could function if people remembered to care for one another. And you never thought about leaving here? Going somewhere more comfortable? This is our place, Ray said with certainty. This is where it all began, where everything transformed. Lazarus knows every inch of this park, every person who frequents it. Why would we leave the paradise we built together? At that very moment, as if to confirm his human companion's words, Lazarus raised his head and looked directly at Marina, with those eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom in the world. Then he did something he rarely did. He whinnied softly, a sound that seemed to carry music and contentment. Lazarus, as if approving his human companion's words, whinnied softly and lay down on the warm grass of the late afternoon. His eyes, which once had reflected only sadness and rejection, now shone with the peace of one who had found his place in the world. And so, as the sun set over the big city, painting the sky gold and orange, the three unlikely friends enjoyed another day of their extraordinarily ordinary life. A life built on the simple but revolutionary foundations of unconditional love, boundless forgiveness, and the certainty that dignity doesn't depend on possessions, but on character. The story of Ray, Arthur and Lazarus would continue to echo through the years, inspiring other stories of transformation, other communities of care, other examples that humanity always finds a way to shine, even in the most unlikely places. But for them, the true victory wasn't in fame or recognition, it was in the silent certainty that they had chosen love over hate, compassion over cruelty, connection over isolation, and in that park, the pulsating center of a small revolution of tenderness, they continued to prove, day after day, that miracles don't need to defy the laws of physics. Sometimes, an open heart is enough to transform the world.